Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Trans-Tasman Talk. I'm Tim Wilms, Editor-in-Chief of the Unshackled here in Melbourne.
And hello, I am Diwa de Boer, editor of Right Minds NZ from Auckland, New Zealand.
Now, since this is our first ever show, I thought I'd do a brief introduction about why we've decided to undertake this project, because we're living in a digital age now where our lives are impacted more by global events. So globalization, globalism, and global citizenship are now the dominant political ideologies. We're more interconnected with the rest of the world like never before. But consequence of that is that mainly Western nations are losing their identity, culture, and freedoms that we once had. Australia and New Zealand, the two Anglosphere nations of the South Pacific, they've always had a close relationship. We're foes on the sports field, but have a shared history and culture. And Australia and New Zealand, we also have a migration agreement, so citizens of each country can travel and work in both nations without a visa, which is obviously having a greater impact in today's world than it probably did previously. So that is why we have Trans-Tasman Talk. Myself and Dua have always had a close working relationship. We were brought together by our secret overlord. I think you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
Yes, as that was more than 2 years ago, but we both thought the time was right to do a live show like this, sharing news and information from our respective nations so that our audiences can know about the similar and different battles we're facing.
You forgot to mention that part of our close relationship is that New Zealand is actually mentioned in the Australian Constitution as one of your states. So
Yes. Australians, it's always been a fantasy of theirs to just annex New Zealand, because it's in our constitution, but it's obviously New Zealand decided to become its own nation. But well, you're the New Zealander. It was actually quite a complicated process to New Zealand independence. Can you explain that?
um, um, I'm sorry, but I'm not actually familiar with the intricacies of how New Zealand separated from Australia.
Oh, you're not?
No, they don't teach that at school here.
Well, there you go. But you actually weren't born in New Zealand. You were born in the Netherlands.
That's right. Yeah. But I have been to school here my whole life, and I've lived here since I was about 7. And I only have New Zealand citizenship as well. None of that dual citizenship rubbish going on here either.
I remember when you first launched Right Minds, because your last name's De Boer, that obviously most people assume that's South African, and so the accusation online was that you're a white supremacist oppressing blacks from South Africa had come over to New Zealand.
Yeah. I've never been to South Africa, and none of my ancestors have ever come from South Africa. But they're sort of like long lost, distant cousins. And it's interesting being here at least in New Zealand and Australia, and the relationship with South Africa, because obviously New Zealand and Australia invaded South Africa twice in the past. So you never know.
Yes, well, there's nothing wrong with South Africans. We should obviously, if you're a white in South Africa, it's okay to be white, but that's a whole other matter. But the main reason why, going back to obviously the Trans-Tasman topic, the reason our nations seem interconnected is I went to New Zealand to cover the 2017 general election, which was actually 2 years ago, nearly to the day that we're launching this, so September 2017. And most Australians, they did not know who the New Zealand Prime Minister was. I mean, I knew there was John Key, and then there was a Bill English, but they just looked after New Zealand themselves. They just quietly got on with the job. And when Jacinda Ardern became Prime Minister, or should I say she was selected to be Prime Minister by Winston Peters, suddenly everyone in Australia knew who she was, and 2 years later they know that they still know who she is, and they also really hate her.
Yes, we have been told by our media that Jacinda is very popular in Australia and that Australians would like her to be your prime minister. New Zealand to Australia is, if you like, if you want her, you can take her. She's all yours.
Yes, because there was mass outrage in Australia where Australia's most popular radio broadcaster, Alan Jones, said that Scott Morrison should be fully briefed to shove a sock down her throat. This was over that Australia had to answer for climate change in the Pacific. And also, what came to light, that he also said Scott Morrison should give her a few backhanders, and if he saw her on the TV again, he'd puke. And in Australia, it was such a affront that you dare criticise, say mean things about Saint Jacinta. But it was interesting. There was a rugby game of that weekend, and New Zealanders, they didn't really rally around their attacked prime minister.
No, that's right. At least the first time in my lifetime that a prime minister has been booed at a rugby match, and I think we are going to see some of that reflected in the polls that will be coming up. She was starting to lose a little bit of popularity, and since July, there have been a lot of failed projects of the Labour Party. A lot of their policies are falling apart. They have several ongoing sex scandals in the party. Their flagship policy has had to be completely abandoned. It was called Kiwi Build, and it may as well be called Commie Build, because it was basically the government trying to build houses. And they didn't build a single house, but they managed to buy a few hundred from private contractors.
That reminds me when we had Kevin Rudd as our Prime Minister in Australia. Oh, God, that was a horrible memory. He had the home insulation scheme where it was a part of the economic stimulus package to insulate new homes with these pink, they were called pink bats, and they actually caused house fires and electrocution. And so reminds me of something like that. I don't know, if Jacinta built the homes, I sort of get the feeling they'd maybe fall down.
Yeah, we had I think the last time something like this was attempted was in the 90s or slightly earlier, and we had the leaky homes crisis. That's a very well-known thing in New Zealand. There are at least 10,000 or more houses that were built that have since had to be fixed at great cost because they started leaking after, within a decade, basically. And there are still some repercussions of that. The housing crisis, which Kiwi Build was supposed to fix, if you remember going back to the election, I actually praised one of Labour's housing policies, which was to remove the metropolitan urban limit around cities, basically to free up land for building. And I said, that's a great policy. And they must have been watching our show because it's the one thing they haven't done in terms of their building policy, and it would have made the biggest difference. And so instead, they've just been trying to build houses, and they've also increased insulation requirements and other kind of, try to improve the quality of rental homes in New Zealand. And what that's done is just driven the price of rents further up. So rental homes have had to be taken off the market to be refitted and to be improved, or people haven't been able to afford to do them and so on. And so you've got, you still have fairly high levels of immigration, and then you have, no increase in the housing stock. And so the housing crisis that started under the national government has just gotten worse under Labour now.
Oh, so you're saying that a socialist is discovering that they can't change the law of economics, and that big government programs don't work?
That's right. Supply and demand are impervious to the wishes of socialist programs.
And what about, because, as I mentioned, Jacinda Ardern, she only became Prime Minister because Winston Peters chose her. What's the assessment of him at the moment? Because obviously, first time he went into coalition with the Nationals in the 90s, that fell apart. What's his political status at the moment?
I feel like he's been a bit more invisible recently. I'm trying to recall the last time he was in the news. I'm genuinely drawing a blank here. What is he doing? He's in a lawsuit with the National Party over leaking details about a superannuation plan, which is why he was taking too much money from superannuation. So he was drawing like the amount that you would get if you were single, but because he's got a partner, he was basically taking twice as much as he should have been. And National Party leaked that, and he's suing them. He has come out and made some statements around. What else? No, I'm drawing a blank. Basically, due to all of the Labour Party scandals the last couple of weeks, I have no idea where he is. He's the foreign minister. He might be traveling somewhere. Yeah.
He's been around forever, Winston Peters. He was originally
in politics he has.
Yeah, a National Party MP. Then he split to create New Zealand First. He's in his 70s now. So obviously time is ticking away for him. Do you think that this is his sort of last stint in power?
So it's almost like an ongoing joke here, but every single election, you have some kind of, you have the rumors that it's his last election. You even had a famous tape where John Key said, Winston's voters will have died off by the next election, basically. None of that has ever materialized, and Winston Peters always comes back.
So that's interesting. So, well, he could go into his 80s, or
yes, yeah, he could. He's got nothing else to do. So as long as he's healthy enough to keep going, my suspicion is he will keep going. Yeah.
So he'll be a bit like with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He'll become a cyborg if he needs to.
Yeah, that's right. You don't know what kind of super drugs they give to these people, but there's some kind of magic that goes on to keep them going forever.
We have got a super chat from one of our longtime fans of Port Film Co-op. It says, please ask guest to help Steele with his wardrobe. You haven't met my colleague Steele Archer, who does the Detonation program, but a lot of our audience here have got think he needs a bit of wardrobe advice.
Okay, well, I'm sorry because my wife does all of my wardrobe and so on, so I can't really pass on any advice other than he needs to find himself, a personal assistant or something like that.
Yeah. So you hear that, Port Film Co-op still needs to find a wife. So that should be the next challenge. Now, we're just live on I should have mentioned, the Unshackled's YouTube channel. Right Minds does have a YouTube channel, but it's one of those personal accounts which Google makes it impossible for you to change.
Yeah, I set it up before all of the changes that they made, and as you've noticed, I may have a bit of flickering here as well. I've got some technical stuff that we're working on, and in the future, the show should be on my channel as well.
But we've got a good audience for the first time here on the Unshackled channel. They're obviously curious about the topic at hand. Now, let's go into, because as I mentioned, it's the 2-year anniversary of Jacinda Ardern, well, not becoming Prime Minister, but since the election. And the reason why Winston Peters selected her is because you have mixed member proportionate system where it's based on proportional representation, not like Australia where we have, well, in the lower house it's single member electorates, and in the Senate it's proportional representation. New Zealand just has one single House of Parliament.
That's right. We have 120 MPs, and some of those are elected in first past the post elections in their electorates, and then I said 40. I might double check that. If someone in the chat knows better, they can correct me there. But whatever the number is at the moment, it might actually be 60, and the rest of them are made up just based on party vote. So the National Party got the largest party vote. They're the largest party in Parliament. But the Labour Party and the Green Party always team up. So they're a bloc, and that would have been basically what you have as a hung parliament, I suppose. And then Winston Peters, being the third faction, got to choose. which side he wanted to go with, and they had negotiations for a few days or weeks, and the Labour Party offered him more, and he had a bit of an ongoing grudge with certain senior members in the National Party, and so in a quite, I don't know if you'd say humiliating fashion, but basically he held a press conference, and Jacinda and Ardern and Bill English had to basically watch on TV to find out which one he had picked. So it was kind of like celebrity prime minister, and you basically they had to watch TV to find out if they got the job.
That was like after our 2010 federal election, where it was a hung parliament, and the two independents, Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott, held a press conference to announce who they'd be backing to be Prime Minister, and Rob Oakeshott, he waffled on for about 20 minutes to then say he was backing Julia Gillard. So they're known in Australia as Oakeshott moments. So when that happened in Australia, we referred to Winston as Winston Oakeshott.
Because that's exactly what happened, yeah.
Now, obviously, Jacinda Ardern, she's keen to promote herself as a feminist, female empowerment, but she obviously hasn't been keeping an eye on the internal Labour Party machinations, because there's been a sex scandal this week.
Yes, and it's not just this week, but it's some of the victims have written public statements and gone to the media this week. So there's been a new development in this sex scandal that's been ongoing since last year, but until this week, the nature of the allegations were not sexual. So it was more like the senior member of her parliamentary staff, and they supposedly like a senior campaign manager in the Labour Party had been harassing nearly a dozen staff, and this week that was elevated to basically to rape. Basically, is that one of the women came forward and said that she was raped, and this has been handled pretty badly by the National Party, the Labour Party president. There has been a open letter today calling on him to resign. The accused is still employed by Jacinda Ardern, is still working for her office, even though this is the believe all women prime minister, and the victims must be automatically believed and so on, and that seems to apply to everybody except for Jacinda and the Labour Party, and this is not the first time it's happened, because last year they had another senior staff member at a Labour youth camp who had been accused by 3 different people of sexual assault as well. And that court case is now ongoing with name suppression as well. And it looks like they're actually going to drop the charges, or I think he's pled guilty, and they're going to sort of send him, give him home detention and permanent name suppression.
Sounds like a Epstein-style deal.
Basically, this is like New Zealand light version of Epstein, and I think when I told someone, they sent me a message saying something like male feminist is code for rapist, basically, and that's kind of the problem. Labour Party has a big male feminist problem.
Yeah, that's the stereotype. If a man tells you he's a male feminist, then, well, ladies, you should probably run away.
Yeah.
Because it's funny that, or I shouldn't, rape's not funny, but it's ironic that you mention that, because Bill Shorten, our former Labour Party leader who thought he was going to become Prime Minister, he was accused in his 20s of raping a woman at a Labour youth camp. So there's sort of parallels there between, and I actually spoke to, this was a number of years ago, a person who'd been in Young Labour and been on one of those camps, and they had to be told not to basically rape. Like it had to be sort of set out from the beginning, and it sort of made you think, gee, like what are these camps?
It's not. It's like you said, it's not a laughing matter. It's not actually funny, but the circumstances and the people who this, who the way that they behave when they're on the receiving end and they need to be dealing with these problems is like at the very least ironic, and but obviously worse than that is very highly hypocritical. I did forget to mention at the youth camp, for instance, they were supplying alcohol to minors as well. But I heard a National Party, someone who used to organize these at the National Party. I believe they said that happens at the National Party as well, as they're basically, this youth camp is basically a bunch of 15-year-olds getting boozed up by, party officials.
Yeah, and I know for a fact that
Which,
that underage drinking has occurred at major political youth functions.
yeah, so it's
Yeah, so obviously, well, they're lawmakers, the major parties, but it's the stereotype.
they get to make the laws; they don't have to follow them.
Yeah. And the stereotype is the youth events, where they're basically just huge parties.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I also want to mention another similarity is that during the where I'm from, the state of Victoria, during the Victorian state election last year, the Greens party, they had basically an epidemic of candidates who'd been accused of sexual misconduct. They eventually had to sack one of them because he'd been accused of rape. And there were also stories about the New South Wales Greens party. They were also had their own sexual misconduct crisis, and that just further proved, because the Greens are even further left than the Labor Party in Australia, that the stereotype is true. Male feminists, you better watch them.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about New Zealand stuff, but I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about Australia now that the ball is in your camp. We had a story in New Zealand this week about the immigration department had asked for increased funding, and they got increased funding to stop boat people from coming to New Zealand. And Australia has always done a good job of protecting us from that. But I believe you've got an ongoing problem with trying to deport a couple of these boat people who were members of the terrorist organization, the Tamil Tigers.
When you say problem, it's basically the usual suspects, the refugee advocates, screeching and the media eating it up. So there's this Tamil family, Prior and Nada Selingam. They're based in the town of Bilawa in central Queensland. They're a Tamil Sri Lankan family because Sri Lanka is a sectarian nation with the Sinhalese majority and who are Buddhist, and the Tamil minority who are Hindu. But the Tamils, not many people, well, they should know this, that the Tamils, they're actually migrants to Sri Lanka. They're originally from India, so you could technically call them invaders. And the civil war in Sri Lanka, my former Sinhalese Sri Lankan Unshackled colleague Suka said that the reason why they didn't accept the Tamils' demands for a separate Tamil nation is because they demanded too much. And the Tamils, they're portrayed as the victims, but they did some horrific things. And the civil war ended in 2009, and then being found not just by big baddie Peter Dutton, there was just an ad called in the baddest MP, but a whole bunch of courts, Australian courts, they're not known for their meanness to foreigners. Have found them not to be refugees, and so they came to Australia illegally, claiming to be refugees. They were found to be not, so therefore they came to Australia illegally, so you get deported.
Mm-hmm.
So,
is it that it's good to hear if that goes through. We haven't had anything that bad in terms of, I think we have sort of student visa overstayers who get deported sometimes, and there's sometimes a little bit of drama involved in that. But it has made the news here, at least on the BFD, which I was going to mention a little bit earlier, but we do have a right-wing blog that's a sort of a conglomeration of different right-wing and even centrist and slightly left-leaning bloggers called the bfd.org.nz. And yeah, we have an Australian writer there who's been talking about the issue with the Tamil refugees in Australia, and it seems like it's at least looks like it's something that's going to be dragging on.
It's not as edgy, in my opinion, as rightminds.nz. That's if you want the full red pill, you go to your website.
Oh, well, thanks. People involved in the BFD have been involved with the National Party, with New Zealand First, and even former Labour Party members are involved in that project as well. So it's intended to be a lot more of a broad news site that's not basically either government owned or owned by these mega left-wing woke corporations.
Now, obviously, a pretty horrific tragedy that affected both our nations was the Christchurch mosque shooting back in March, and it's been back in the focus in Australia this week because our Australian newspaper owned by News Corp, they're releasing a series of articles about the killer Brenton Tarrant's life. He's currently in custody in New Zealand awaiting trial because he's pleaded not guilty, and so far it's just talking about his childhood and how he got sucked into this like evil, the far right world online. That's sort of the summary of it. And we also had our because we had a whole bunch of websites blocked by our ISPs after the massacre because they were broadcasting the footage, and so Scott Morrison he's now got a directive in place that if any website hosts the mosque shooting footage, then they're blocked. And so we have what's called the e-safety commissioner in Australia, who announced that initially 45 sites were blocked, but now it's down to 8 that have been blocked on these grounds. I guess you can refer to them as the Hateful Eight sites.
Is it like all of the 8 different Chan sites or something like that?
Yeah. Me personally, I've been on them a few times. I can never figure out how to use them. Like that's.
What I can figure out in New Zealand is the only, at least the top users of these websites in New Zealand seem to be the journalists who write tutorials on how to use them.
Yes, 8chan, that was featured in the Australian articles, that he got praised on there, and that's where he got his world view from. But it was interesting that it talked about also his travel as well, because he didn't just. The interesting thing they said, he didn't just like fall into the online vortex. He actually was affected by his real life travels to the Middle East and Europe and that. So it wasn't
exactly. Yeah.
They couldn't say it was a complete case of he was just living online.
Yeah, that's the thing with online radicalization. Except when the guy who was radicalized online traveled extensively. From North Korea to Pakistan and Eastern Europe and so on, and everywhere in between. I have to read those. Still have to read those articles that have just been sent through to me today. I'll see if there's anything interesting there. But obviously, what's a bit of a farce in New Zealand in terms of what's going on is that the trial has been delayed a number of times, and the last delay pushes it into Ramadan next year.
Ooh.
And so then obviously it's like, well, that's kind of insensitive and a bit, if the witnesses are doing Ramadan, so they'll probably, instead of pulling it forward, of course, they'll keep pushing it back and back. And and coincidentally, we could say almost coincidentally, it's been announced this month that the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the mastermind behind 9/11. He's got a trial date set for 2021. So the guy who was behind, 9/11 will get his trial 20 years after he masterminded his terrorist attack. And I have the feeling that at the rate things are going in New Zealand, it'll be about 20 years before we get a trial for Brent and Tarrant as well.
And obviously, they're not looking forward to the trial of the New Zealand authorities, because Tarrant will want to use it as a theatre and turn it into a show trial.
Yes, but I don't quite understand their concerns around that, because you've got to have the trial anyway, and so the best thing you can do is have the trial and get it over with, right? And now instead you have the situation where they can drag it on and keep milking stories, keep selling advertisements, and the media makes tons of money off the never-ending stories. The lawyers rake in tons of cash from as the case goes on and on and on, and the taxpayers always foot the bill. And the victims, they don't get any swift justice, and they won't get any justice in this case either, because in New Zealand we generally sentence concurrently. So if they do this according to normal New Zealand standards, he would be getting 51 life sentences to be served concurrently, which means he'd only spend about 20, 30 years in jail. They'll obviously tweak things a little bit to throw the book at him properly. Like, it is possible to give life without parole in New Zealand. It's just never been done before. And that's probably what they're looking at. But because our justice system, probably just like yours, is such a joke, that might be the hardest thing they're struggling with, is figuring out how they can actually lock him away forever, because they spent so long gearing the justice system to benefit criminals rather than victims. Now they have a case where they have to do some measure of justice to the victims, or face probably wide-scale riots, and that seems to be a trickier business than they bargained for. Else, I really don't see how they can just keep delaying it, right? Because you've got video footage and 50 corpses. It shouldn't be a difficult trial.
Well, I get the feeling in this situation, though, there aren't going to be too many human rights lawyers in New Zealand complaining that he's not having his day in court. I don't sort of think that that's sort of he's the sort of criminal they're really going to arc up about.
No, absolutely not. And same thing with sending mail. Like, he's still awaiting trial, but they've obviously blocked his mail from being sent out. He sent some letters to his mother, and that was considered to be that was a big scandal, basically. And the not the Minister for Prisons, but one of the bureaucrats who basically runs the prison system had to actually come out and apologize that they hadn't blocked his letters and censored them properly, and so on. There has been a little bit of pushback from people on the left and the right, saying, well, he's still just being held on charges. You haven't actually put the guy through the courts yet. He hasn't actually been tried yet. And if you're censoring, if you're saying he can't send mail, then you're basically saying he's guilty already, but you haven't had the trial.
And obviously he hasn't been found guilty, and so you technically have to call him the alleged killer.
Yeah, so same, yeah. So in the first couple of weeks, you had a lot of articles calling him the killer and so on, and that's now being walked back. And every single article you see is, the alleged gunman, the alleged killer, and on and on and on it goes.
Well, they're probably hating having to do that.
Yeah. I actually because I haven't done that ever, and I got some complaints from somebody saying, this could lead to they could claim he's being mistried and so on, and which is why they're doing it, because it basically turns into one giant farce, and everyone kind of has to, it's a game basically.
Now, obviously, one of the first things Jacinda Ardern announced after the Christchurch massacre is that our gun laws will change, and obviously everyone was egging her on to adopt the Australia model. So how's the gun confiscation going?
Well, I wrote last week that the gun confiscation is going about as well as the Australian gun confiscation went, which is not very well. At best, they probably have about 8% of the semi-automatics that they have confiscated is the right word. And probably it's more accurate to say they're, maybe have 4 or 5% of them. They're not releasing a breakdown because the firearms, the law changes didn't affect semi-automatics. They affected any firearm that has a magazine capacity of more than 10. That includes 22s. So any lever action firearms, any pump action firearms, a lot of pump action shotguns, all of these are now prohibited firearms, and they can either be modified or handed in. And a lot of people have, cheaper, older firearms that have been caught up in this, and they're taking the chance to sell those to the government and then use the money to buy some newer equipment. And they're not actually getting a very good number of semi-automatics. And on top of that, there are rumors they've actually lost the registered databases of the military-style semi-automatics. So there were 15,000 of those. Some of those are now illegal, some of them are not, because the ones that were 22 caliber are still legal. But yeah, there are rumors that they have lost everything from the register of these military-style semi-automatics to like pistols and collectors' firearms. So it's a bit of a disaster. Well, I say a bit of a disaster. That's under exaggerating. It's a disaster, and the full scale of the disaster is yet to be revealed, because they're being incredibly cagey. If you watch Question Time in Parliament, where the opposition is trying to ask questions about, to get more accurate numbers, all those questions get dodged. All of the IOA requests, which is the Official Information Act in New Zealand, you probably have a similar one in Australia, where basically anyone can request information from a government department. Yeah, and so all of those requests pertaining to this are being ignored or delayed, and it's looking, it's looking like it will possibly be even worse than Australia, where almost everything disappears and goes underground because of absolute incompetence. And the way it's carried out, I suspect a lot of people are don't trust the government very much after this.
Well, that sounds like an absolute clusterfuck in every way. I mean, getting 5% of the guns, and then the people who are handing them in are actually trying to make a profit on getting some better ones, and then they don't know actually who's got the guns.
Yeah. And now they want to introduce a new set of Firearms Amendment Act that will include a register for all firearms, because we don't have a register we did have one that was abandoned about 30 or 40 years ago, and they want to bring that back. But people are saying, well, you had a register of a few 20, 30, 40,000, and you've probably lost that, or at least you can't confirm it still exists. And you want to register 1.5 million firearms and keep track of that and not lose it and not leak it and so on. We've had a number of high-profile data leaks from 3 or 4 different government departments in the last month as well. So I think a lot of this is going to come to a screeching halt, and they're going to have to backtrack somewhere, or they're just going to have to just leave it as it is, kind of like Australia has done, where they keep the buyback amnesty that you had has technically never ended, I believe. Well, they keep running it like this. They're on their 20th or 30th one. They keep extending it. So we're heading for a situation like that. And then it might end up like I saw a picture from, was it West Australia, about BB guns that were being sought by the police. So yeah. So it's not that bad here, but people are looking over at that and thinking, no thanks.
Well, people who should really take note of that is the people of the United States, because you've got one of the presidential candidates for the Democrats, Beto O'Rourke, saying he's going to do just that. You should try and see if you can get that article published on a US-based website, because I think they'd like to know, because definitely the fake news, NBC, Huffington Post, CNN isn't going to report that.
Yes, I should send it through to a few of them, because it's laughable when people like Beto O'Rourke say, we're just going to do it like Australia did it and New Zealand did it. And well, if you look at the numbers, in America, the numbers would be even worse, right? They would get like 0.1% or something, if they were lucky.
Now, going on to other developments post Christchurch, is that there's been calls to crack down on free speech in New Zealand, or sorry, hate speech. That's the official term. And you actually have a Greens politician who's leading the charge in New Zealand. I asked you about her before on an Unshackled Waves episode, but she's back again.
Yes, Gauri's Gaharaman, Green Party MP, has gone to the United States to visit the United Nations headquarters. So she's posted a Facebook post of her with Ilhan Omar.
Yeah, let's have a look at that.
And I'm sure that everyone in the audience knows who they are. So there's the tweet. And everyone who's been paying attention to Ilhan Omar will know that she's going through a divorce at the moment because she has been cheating on her husband with a campaign manager. So a shining beacon of well, she's supposed to be a shining beacon of Islam in the U.S. Congress. I'm not really sure this is what any decent percentage of Muslims imagine to be an example of the kind of representative they would like to have. The ones I know sure don't. Yeah, it's just what an embarrassment, what a disaster. And that's the kind. But that's what Gauri's wants to attach herself to, because this is reported in the New Zealand media, like, oh yes, Ilhan Omar is the greatest thing ever, and she's so amazing. It's yeah.
Yeah, Ilhan Omar, her wearing the hijab, or it doesn't look like one. It looks like some sort of hat. It hasn't really helped her be immodest, to put it politely.
No, that's right. And it's often that way in politics with the people who try and sort of virtue signal a lot in one way. Are behind the scenes they're actually doing the exact opposite of what they're trying to, the image that they're trying to project onto other people.
Even Muslim ones.
That's right. Even Muslim ones. Huh. And I suppose the funny thing about the tweet. The actual tweets that I wanted to mention were, she talks about how great it is that women of color can meet and plan all of these things. But of course, it's important to point out that Gauri is not actually a woman of color. She's a Persian from Iran, and that's about as Caucasian as you can get.
Yeah, she doesn't know her own race.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can probably call her the Ilhan Omar of New Zealand, Gauri's, except not the sleeping around, because Gauri, she is in a relationship with one of your local comedians, Guy Williams. Right. I'll just put a photo of him up on the screen. There he is there. So obviously thinks he looks quite goofy there with his bow tie and his glasses there.
Yeah, that's right. And his most recent show is #1 trending on YouTube in New Zealand at the moment, although the corresponding media articles have been deleted, and that's because he went and hung out with a gang member from Gisborne, and this is the Mongrel Mob, and they run a healthy eating program that is called Heil's Kitchen, and that's Heil, as in, that kind of Heil, and the guy who runs it has two giant swastikas on his on his cheeks. So he's sitting there interviewing this guy with two giant swastikas on his cheeks, who runs something that's comes straight out of the Third Reich, and these guys are and of course they're a Maori gang as well. So they're and a non-Aryan ethnic group as well, and a violent gang on top of that. So the guy who he was interviewing has spent 7 years in prison for, chopping somebody's fingers off, and on it goes. He does it in a comedic way. He does do it in a comedic way, but I'm not really sure if that really does fit in with with Golriza's kind of, anti-fascist activities, it seems a little contradictory when your boyfriend is going around interviewing, people who have swastikas tattooed onto their cheeks.
Just wait until she gets back from New York.
Yes, that may become a very awkward conversation.
And now, obviously, I'm not going to show a portion of that video report because we are on YouTube and we don't want to give them an excuse to take us off.
No, that's right. But if anyone is looking for the video, you can just Google Hyle's Kitchen, and it should be the top video because it is the most popular one in New Zealand at the moment.
Well, they have talked about the media, the link between healthy eating and fitness and white supremacy. Right. Yes,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So it gets even more sinister if you put those connections together as well.
And obviously, it's been quiet in Australia. There's obviously a lot more happening in New Zealand, but there's a few things you've got your eye on.
Yes, that's right. I did hear that you guys are picking up drug testing for welfare recipients as well now, which is a traditional staple of right-wing governments, right?
Yes, and but it's currently held up in our Senate because Jackie Lambie, who's the Tasmanian independent, she's they need her support to pass it. Now, she was previously in the Senate, but she got knocked out because of the dual citizenship saga, but she's back now, and so she's offering what I think most Australians think is a pretty good ultimatum that, sure, drug test welfare recipients, but the politicians have to be drug tested as well, and it's not going down well with the people in Canberra. I'll turn your mic back on.
Sorry, I had a plane going overhead, so I muted it temporarily. I was saying, why am I not surprised that the politicians would be so resistant to drug testing as well? We did have a drug testing program tried out in New Zealand that has been abandoned probably a couple of governments ago, if I remember correctly, or it runs. They use a little bit of it, but it's not considered to be effective by the media anyway. And under Jacinda, obviously, the number of welfare recipients has gone through the roof. And usually during the kind of more right-leaning governments, the number of welfare recipients slowly goes down, and then the left-wing government goes back up, and then in a little like a nice wave up and down, as the governments come and go.
Yeah, there's been a whole bunch of medical. Hang on, I can hear myself for the first time.
Hold on, okay.
What did you do?
I'm sorry.
It was all going so well for our
first show. Now?
Yes, it's better now. I can't hear myself. I hate hearing myself on air. I think the audience. Hope the audience don't.
All right.
Yep. So all the medical experts have said that there's no evidence that it works in that, but the conservative side of politics, they still believe that beating up on dole bludgers is a proven political strategy. But yeah, like I said, they're not handling this ultimatum well, and they're not actually proposing if you fail it, you're going to lose your benefits. It's just that you'll get more and more of it quarantined. If you fail, then you'll be put on some sort of rehabilitation program. So it's not if you test positive, they're going to make you starve.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to the program anyway. And I'm, whether it's a good vote winner, I don't know, but it is a good idea in terms of, like trying to reduce welfare dependency. I think is always a positive thing, and it is often no coincidence anyway that people who are heavy drug users end up on welfare because it takes up all of their money.
And any other questions you have about Australian politics?
I did have one more thing written down. The religious freedom bill that Scott Morrison has promised, and the ongoing Israel-Folau court case as well is something of interest to New Zealanders, especially his wife Maria plays for the Silver Ferns here in New Zealand, and we've all been following that case quite closely. But I don't know any of the details of this sort of religious freedom bill that you were supposed to be getting, other than some concerns that people were having about they were basically worried that possibly criticism of religion, including Islam, could be made illegal and so on. But yeah.
So the Attorney General, Christian Porter, he's finally released the draft. It's called a Religious Discrimination Act, not a religious freedom, because a lot of conservatives said we don't want to make religious freedom a positive right, because then it opens up a Pandora's box before the courts and everything like that. So the only really concrete thing that's in this Religious Discrimination Act is that it'll protect the private expression of religious views for employees in their own time, provided it doesn't have a huge detrimental impact on the employer. So the way that I see it, I actually don't think it would protect Israel Folau from being sacked, because people say it was his private Instagram account. It wasn't really private. I mean, the reason why he had all those hundreds of thousands of followers is not because they liked Israel Folau just as a person. It's because he was Australia's best rugby player. So that's why they followed him. So the Rugby Australia, they can argue that his Instagram account is connected to work. But say if Israel Folau was a factory worker and he put that on his Instagram, then he couldn't be sacked.
So is there any has there been anything from the court case as to how he's arguing his defense and so on? Because the clause I believe that they were going with was bringing the employer into disrepute, right? Is that still the status?
Yeah,
of it?
Breaching the player code of conduct, the social media policy. Israel Folau, he's going in for, well, he raised $2 million, so he can afford some lawyers who are going to throw everything at Rugby Australia. So he wants his contract reinstated, wants to play for the Wallabies again, obviously wants compensation for how he's being treated. So there's no backing down on that side. That some have been speculating, could there be a confidential settlement? I think because the people he gave to Israel Folau's crowdfunding, they're going to want blood from Rugby Australia.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. Yeah.
He's on a crusade now. Well, he's got to be.
I wrote in support of him at the time, saying that it was going to be well worth the the money in terms of entertainment and hopefully getting some kind of interesting result back at Australian rugby. Because I suppose a lot of Kiwis would also be happy to see Australian rugby take a hit anyway, right? So.
We all thought everything was going well after our big victory at Perth during the first Bledisloe Cup test, where we won 48-26. Everyone was like, oh, we don't need Israel Folau after all, and then the next week gets slaughtered 36-0.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Australia Rugby, for that.
All right, I think we've made a good start to first episode of Trans-Tasman talk. We'll sort it out, getting it on the Right Minds channel. You're going to have to hold that up higher.
I am. I just remembered that I was going to show this off to people. We've got a bit of our own MAGA movement going here. So we've got the Make Ardern Go Away stickers that Mike from the Kiwi Gun blog is basically sending these out. I'm trying to hold this up and talk to the mic at the same time. Hold on. Be that focused. And so these are bumper stickers on the cars. I've seen a couple of pictures, especially down on the South Island, on people's utes and so on. A lot of the farmers are getting more and more upset with her policies. Obviously, they want zero carbon bill and so on. The oil and gas industry has been put out of work by Jacinda. All of the gun owners are upset and so on. So this is kind of and it really triggers the media when they get this whole MAGA thing, the Trump Association, and then putting Jacinda on it is perfect.
Well, New Zealand's next election is in 2020, so MAGA 2020 has a different meaning in New Zealand.
Yeah, so this is going to be while the American election is going on. We'll have this in New Zealand, and I'm hoping somebody puts a couple of these big MAGA, posters up, like giant billboards and things at election time. That's bound to be really funny.
Didn't one of your local online marketplaces take down some MAGA memorabilia?
Yeah, so that's how it got really famous when Trade Me, which is the New Zealand kind of eBay, they banned the Make Our Dern Go Away hat, and that put it on the national radar, and they've been flying out off the printing presses and so on, the hats and the stickers, in a similar way that they did a similar thing with these It's Okay to Be White t-shirts a few months back. And the same thing is obviously when it hit the media, then and Trade Me banned them, then they started flying off all of the different alternative marketplaces and so on. So yeah, the media is good at selling stuff if you've got some controversial products.
Send some over to Australia, because there's a lot of Australians who'd love that as well.
Who'd love them. Yeah.
Go
to, if you're interested, go to or just Google Kiwi Gun Blog, and I think it's kiwigunblog.wordpress.com. But there's a contact form, and send the guy your details, and in return for a donation, he might ship them across the Tasman. I can't confirm that. But he's more than happy to send them out normally. So,
yeah. And probably the number one thing at the moment that gets our audience riled up is a stupid thing that Jacinda Ardern's done lately, like wearing the hijab again at some Muslims women's conference.
Yeah, that's right. So, and she at the time she suggested holding a special summit to teach Muslim women how to go into politics and so on, which becomes kind of embarrassing when you have to try and get a certain small segment of the population to run a special conference to get them to go into local politics. Yeah.
We should definitely arrange to get one of those mega stickers sent to Alan Jones, our broadcaster in Sydney.
That's a good idea. I will mention it to Mike and see if he will just send a couple through to
2GB.
Is it Sky that he works for?
He works for Sky, but 2GB is where he does his daily show. Hopefully he's not too rattled that he wouldn't have a sort of a freak out if he got that in the mail.
Very good.
And so we intend for this show to be up on podcast form as well in the coming week or so. We'll arrange that. We just wanted to get the first show out of our belt, and there'll be a post on the Unshackled.net website, and obviously the Right Minds
as well
website as well. And yeah, we'll be back again same time Australia and New Zealand time next Tuesday.
See you then.
Although it's coming up to daylight savings, where I think New Zealand goes a week earlier than us, so it's probably going to mess things up for that.
Yeah, week. We'll take that as it goes. There will be announcements on the Unshackled page or the Right Minds page if there are any such delays. But we do hope to make this a weekly show, and if we have to tweak the times, then we have to tweak the times.
Until next week, thank you everyone for watching in the live chat, and we'll see you again next week, next Tuesday.